Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Keegan Toscano's Milestone 4 presentation, the Digital Craftsman. I'm Carlo Parente, and I'll be acting as the program rep. Vincent Huey is Keegan's supervisor, and Jason Ramelson is the second reader. We also have Marco Polo, who's the chair of the graduate program, associate chair of the graduate program. As this is Keegan's final presentation, we have two external critics today. We have Veronica Madonna and Haji Nakamura. Veronica is an architect. She has her own practice, but has worked at Moriyama Toshiba. Recently awarded she's now a fellow with the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. So congratulations, Veronica. She was formerly a principal at Moriyama Toshiba. We also have, Haji. And Haji has actually taught at Ryerson in the School of Interior Design, and he's an architect and is now an associate at SVN Architects and has taught at a guest critic in our department, and now also teaches at Waterloo, I believe you're saying, Haji. So with that really short introduction, and I apologize for the short introduction, I'm gonna ask Keegan to present. He has 20 minutes to present. He's got a video, so we'll run the video, and following the video, we'll have our standard 20 to 30 minutes for clarifications and questions from our critics and the supervisor and from Jason as well. So without further ado, let's have Jason's video start.
The current state of architectural design is inherently abstract in nature. This is evident given the emergence of technologies that have spawned the utilization of abstract digital tools, forms of representation, and processes of making. As a result, these abstractions have become increasingly difficult to situate within the context of craftsmanship, as they fail to conform to any conventional classification of the term. Thus, craftsmanship, as a design methodology, neglects to play a meaningful role within the framework of our contemporary architectural discourse. However, this erasure of the craftsman and craftsmanship is not solely brought about by modern interventions, but is also attributed to its archaic definitions that limit its perception as part of a specific vocation or expectation. These perspectives have been interpreted in varying manners that seem reductive in their efforts to accurately depict its connotations towards architectural design. Therefore, these designations have been analyzed to extrapolate a set of core principles and characteristics that provide a theoretical foundation in distinguishing the craftsman's unique process towards the design of architecture. These findings are best illustrated through the design methodologies implemented by Filippo Brunelleschi, an architect and craftsman of the Renaissance whose work supports propositions levied by scholars such as Richard Sennett in signifying that craftsmanship within the context of architecture serves a far more complex understanding by having a more material-based dialogical consequence between the craftsman's process and the quality of space it creates. These complexities have been distilled through a precise taxonomy that positions craftsmanship as a multifaceted mechanism where the elements of engagement, creativity, innovation, risk, and authorship are critical facets of the craftsman's process. Here, engagement alludes to the human condition, obliging the architect to remain an active participant by directly interacting with the tools, materials, and techniques at play. This can be perceived through Brunelleschi's dome atop the Florence Cathedral that bears a unique herringbone structure initially explored at a reduced scale. Within this process, the architect is constantly interacting with the material to decipher the aggregation of various masonry patterns, while also engaging with the variety of tools to manipulate the dome's geometry and to facilitate its assembly. This level of engagement proposes that as part of approaching architectural design, the craftsman relies on the pursuit of making to constantly form and reform their design ideas. Alternatively, creativity and innovation work cyclically, continually operating between the development of ideas facilitated by tacit knowledge and implementing these concepts as a method of interfacing between problem solving and problem finding. This phenomenon can be interpreted through a set of unique tools and techniques that were developed as part of an iterative process in aiding with the dome's design. These novel apparatuses consisted of rope guides used to interpret the trajectory of the dome and overhanging counterweights to assist in supporting the structure as it was pieced together. These solutions began as conceptual ideas sparked by the craftsman's creativity and later manifested as part of the craftsman's repertoire of tools. These core principles inherently contribute to the workmanship of risk, a consequence of the craftsman's engagement in controlling the tools against the material, that in turn commands diversity and variation. This characteristic of risk reflects the discrepancies found in the octagonal dome that begin to emerge due to the process of translation between the perception of the guide and the interpreted placement of masonry units by the craftsman, resulting in deviated trajectories, compensations, and an asymmetrical form. As suggested by David Pye, this form of workmanship maintains that the quality is never predetermined, but rests entirely on the craftsmen as they work. Thus, the gravity of the architect's engagement, creativity, innovation, and workmanship suggest a high degree of authorship over the design process, as each subtlety and nuance of the craftsman's approach is carefully curated as part of a distinctive effort in pursuing the architectural design. The accumulation of these principles and characteristics suggests that the architect as a craftsman relies upon a highly specific method of making, indicating that for craft to function as a useful design methodology today, these principles and characteristics must serve as a point of continuity in sustaining the notion of craftsmanship within our contemporary architectural discourse. However, in analyzing a series of architectural case studies, it is apparent that this perspective of design has waned with time, gradually shifting towards a dependency that favors the efficiencies of digital technologies, paving the way for the immaterial architect. Projects such as Gaudi's La Sagrada Familia, Alto's Experimental House, and Zumthor's Broder Klaus Field Chapel signify a design methodology that resembles a traditional craftsman's design approach, while in stark contrast, the digital turn of architectural design has brought about projects such as Francois Roche's Waterflux and Amanda Levitt's house in Dublin that have been parametrically derived and digitally fabricated, thus failing to conform to crafts taxonomy, making it difficult to situate as part of a contemporary notion of craftsmanship. Moreover, mapping these projects indicates two dominant classifications of design, one that focuses on a material-based approach of the handmade and that of the immaterial or digitally abstracted. However, as these two quadrants are saturated with information, the opposing quadrants lack precedent, indicating a gap in architectural design, revealing an opportunity to re-evaluate a contemporary approach to craftsmanship. This territory suggests that although these technologies currently offer a passive approach to design, their strict and deterministic behaviors as calm technologies can be subverted by the architect as part of a collaborative process that exists based on crafts taxonomy, interfacing between the architect's involvement as the craftsman and the application of their custom repertoire of digital tools. This discussion of the digital craftsman shall be investigated through the design proposal of the Guildwood Chapel, located within the context of Toronto's Guild Park, a site that has served to commemorate and preserve the remnants of architectural fragments born out of the Canadian arts and crafts movement of the 1890s. Upon investigating this site, its natural light became a prominent feature, enabling the craftsman to factor in its use as a design concept, while the rich significance of the masonry context serves as an inspiration in exploring materiality. Thus, the Guildwood Chapel shall be developed as an investigative medium through which the architect as the digital craftsman explores a novel material-based process towards the design and manifestation of architecture. This approach to architectural design begins in a familiar place by exploring ideas at a conceptual level, achieved through a series of sketches that are by virtue a formal aspect of architectural design. These illustrations serve as a guiding principle to the craftsman in exploring the possibilities of the chapel's probable form, response to light, and materiality. However, where design would traditionally begin to move into the digital detailing and representation of the structure, the digital craftsman's process diverges towards an alternate material-based approach, signifying a new stratum of design exploration by the architect. Here, the focus of the craftsman's process dives into a deeper, more informal realm, where the curation of the craftsman's strategy of making becomes a critical component to achieving the intended masonry design of the chapel. However, As a craftsman, the architect no longer relies on the dependency of ubiquitous methodologies, but rather focuses on developing a set of custom processes as a method of working towards their design intentions. Thus, as the digital craftsman, the architect explores their own set of digital technologies as tools that can be implemented as part of the design process. Yet, as indicated in the discourse of this thesis, through the work of icons such as Brunelleschi, it is apparent that this process must adhere to a strict set of principles and characteristics. These include the elements of engagement, creativity, innovation, risk, and authorship as critical facets to the process of designing the Guildwood Chapel. Where the principle of engagement can be understood through the development of a unique augmented interface that enables the architect to participate in the crafting process by directly controlling an array of mechanical and analog tools in close correspondence to the use of the AR guides. This high-tech, high-touch methodology allows for an active yet collaborative process, enabling the maker to initially investigate the development of the chapel's materiality and later aid in the design of the structure itself. This principle of engagement can be recognized through the design ideas explored at the scale of the brick, where the referential use of the AR guides allows the craftsman to control the tool in exploring various surface conditions and details. This enables the craftsman to actively participate in crafting a series of distinguishing features that can be archived as part of the digital sketch, storing the craftsman's particular actions of carving the clay to be later reconfigured in crafting various other iterations. Akin to the traditional craftsman, creativity and innovation occur around the development of the tools and techniques implemented. This is apparent based on the previously derived collaborative interface and reflected through the instrumentality of the digital craftsman's variety of tools that have been customized and progressively iterated to fit the evolving needs of the craftsman's design process. This is expressed at an initial stage of distinguishing the masonry units, perceived through the constant refinements made to the end effectors, allowing the maker to continually explore new ideas and yield new possibilities in adapting the chapel's masonry design. As contributing factors, the processes of engagement, creativity, and innovation inherently contribute to the workmanship of risk, emerging as part of a collaborative process where the interpretation of the AR guides as a result of the craftsman's engagement and input command diversity and variation in the crafted output. Thus, within the context of the digital craftsman, risk maintains that the quality of work produced is entirely dependent on the craftsman's actions as they work. Therefore, when examining the design of the chapel at the scale of its individual masonry units, it can be said that the extensive process of developing the unique interface, custom end effectors, and crafted outcomes embodies the authorship of the craftsman's technique, indicating that these subtleties and nuances curated by the digital craftsman have contributed to the gradual realization and novelty of the chapel's materiality based on the distinctions of the architect's design methodology. In referencing the variety of crafted units and the possibility of additional configurations, the craftsman explores a more holistic view of the chapel's design by creating a two-dimensional mosaic layout based on the previously illustrated design intentions of a vaulted structure. This mosaic serves a similar purpose to that of the AR guides in allowing the architect to adapt the design of the Guildwood Chapel while on site, suggesting that the principles and characteristics of crafts taxonomy can operate at various scales of design, from the pursuit of the chapel's materiality to the continuity of its structure at large. However, while maintaining aspects of engagement through a similar collaborative AR interface, the applicability of the craftsman's previous repertoire of tools is not directly transferred. Therefore, the craftsman must rely on their creativity and innovation to derive a new set of tools that aid in distinguishing the chapel's form. These tools were iteratively developed based on the chapel's vaulted structure, using a series of curve-cut platforms restrained by pistons, allowing the craftsman to dynamically adapt the curvature of the platform as required. Additionally, these platforms serve the added benefit of acting as a scaffolding, continually supporting the structure as the bricks are laid, while the use of trackers on the build surface help to reference the mosaic layout, allowing the craftsman to visualize an overlaid guide of a particular art segment as the functionality of the tool enables them to manipulate the platform's placement and curvature to adapt the trajectory of the chapel's form. In the scenario of the chapel's design, a group of craftsmen would set up shop on site, crafting the various masonry units by either using the craftsman's digital sketch to configure the bricks or produce new variations as deemed necessary. Simultaneously, the scaffolding tool would also be positioned on site to commence the design process and the chapel's construction. Working with the architect's initial design intentions, the craftsmen engage in the gradual erection of the arch segments, using the AR interface to reference, craft, pick, and place the required units in developing the chapel's form. As part of this interface, the use of the AR guides in reference to the as-built sections allows the maker to gauge any discrepancies in the chapel structure, making adjustments by fixing the platform's profile to match the anticipated trajectory, or by distinguishing probable collisions or gaps and relaying this information to ensure that specific masonry units are crafted to allow the structure to adapt to the altered form. These nuances arise as a factor of the human condition in placing the bricks, thus manipulating the form during the design process. This aspect of the workmanship of risk refers to the consequence by which the makers or makers involved interpret the craftsman's vision, where contrasting expectations, attitudes, and skill set translate into equally contrasting outcomes. This condition can be understood through the craftsman's engagement with the tool, the laying of the material, and the techniques used, but can also be heightened within the context of the chapel's design through a shift in agency bestowed upon other craftspeople that present varying consequences to the chapel's construction. Thus, the mosaic augmentation, coupled with the craftsman's participation, presents a great deal of risk in the interpretation and inevitable expression of the final design. However, the craftsman is not restricted to the initial mosaic configuration and is free to change the design, updating the mosaic to share their revised vision with other collaborators. This may include swapping certain masonry units within a specific section, or simply removing them altogether to curate specific light portals in adapting the design to real-world lighting conditions. However, the craftsman's agency to influence a chapel's design is not limited to the swapping or omission of masonry units itself, but is also in their capacity to use the articulated build plates to alter the chapel's overall form. This can be implemented to various degrees, from simply fixing the anticipated trajectory of the arch to a more holistic approach of adapting the chapel's design to alternate configurations. This agency does not restrict the craftsman from having to follow a specific design, but rather allows them to manipulate and derive the chapel's form accordingly. Thus, the architect as the craftsman can continually form the chapel throughout the construction process by adapting their tools, materials, and techniques to manipulate the design on an ongoing basis, solidifying the authority of the digital craftsman and the design methodology as a novel perspective towards architectural design. As illustrated within this design approach, the architect's process conducts an internal dialogue as a set of deliberate actions based on continuous, iterative experimentations, errors, and modifications that eventually lead to some innovative, unexpected, unpredictable outcome that is gradually discovered in the intertwined process of conception and production. This design process suggests that as the craftsman, the architect's process towards the design of the chapel is initiated by an in-depth investigation that not only examines the design development of the structure itself, but in essence all the elements that contribute to its manifestation. Reflecting upon the digital craftsman's approach towards the manifestation of the Gildwood Chapel, it is evident that the architect's process now shares a unique perspective towards the design of architecture. Rather than perceiving design and making as two separate entities of an architectural discourse, the craftsman focuses on a material-based approach of making as a methodology of influencing and executing design. Thus, the digital craftsman's approach towards architectural design can be said to have a more material-based yet dialogical consequence between the craftsman's process and the qualities of the space it creates. These qualities are as follows. Craft is beauty. There is a general appreciation for the skill it takes to craft certain architectural elements. This can be understood through the digital craftsman's process that follows a suite of complex and chaotic processes to acquire a desired result. This aspect of beauty can be examined at the various scales of the chapel's craftsmanship, from the material metamorphosis of the clay into its individual masonry units, raised to the compositional value of the chapel itself. Upon entering the chapel, the variation, arrangement, and curation of the custom masonry units in correspondence to the lighting of the site signifies an appreciation by those who experience it, alluding to the time, effort, and process invested in its design and making, that veils the complexities of the processes needed to translate the raw material into a thing that is not simply well made, but is transfigured into a beautiful aspect of the chapel's design. Craft is detail. The detail in contemporary architectural design is most often a representation of two-dimensional drawings, demonstrating the specific order by which components come together, not frequently used as an expressive quality of design, but rather concealed or hidden. Within the context of craftsmanship, however, the detail and its expression takes on a more prolific meaning. As illustrated in the design process, the details implemented in the chapel are not abstract in nature, but are rather highly specific to the methods of making. These crafted details are implemented as characteristics that are necessary and cherished aspects of the design, tactfully considered in the process of making. This can be perceived through the various details explored, serving as both functional and expressive to the chapel's character. Craft is communicative. In contemporary architectural design, most of the assembled parts are obscured behind panels, facades, and cladding. Craft seeks to remove this obscurity, revealing the role of each component as a greater significance to the whole. This rather emphasizes the expression in the intersection of these materials and the necessary connections that they share. In the case of the chapel's design, this can be seen through the various texturing and positioning of the masonry units, as to provide visual cues, tactile responses, directionality, and atmospheric ambience, while also using the masonry to frame key features and create reveals. Craft is unique. The implementation of the craftsman's process and the resulting design and making of architecture is unique to the situation, fabricator, installer, and end user. It represents the connection between functionality and beauty, where each element, through the craftsman's process, is carefully measured and customized in order for it to work exactly as intended. The masonry units of the Gilwood Chapel are unique to its design, detailing, and expression, precisely crafted and curated as part of a mosaic to interact with the concept of light and express this intention to the observer. Craft is imperfect. By way of the craftsman, the chapel's design follows the Japanese notion of wabi-sabi, an aesthetical style that intentionally embraces imprecision, imperfection, and incompleteness. While this cannot be expressed through the visualization of the chapel, the former design research can be used to supplement this understanding of the inadequacies in the crafted components and the distinct value and beauty of its flawed characteristics. This can be examined through variations seen in similar components, the compensating irregularities of the mortar connections, and the overall tessellation of the masonry units. Craft is authentic. As discussed previously, the digital craftsman's process of making is deeply steeped in its condition of the architect having authority or authorship over the act of design and making. Likewise, the craftsman's process extends this notion to the concept of authenticity, a reflective quality placed on the work done. This illustrates the honesty of the materials, tools, and techniques that have been curated to purposefully come together in celebrating their uniqueness within the design of the chapel. As recognized through the discourse of this thesis, the notion of craftsmanship provides a dialogical role in architectural design, between the digital craftsman's unique perspective of making and the translation of these material-based processes towards the expression of our carefully curated architectural environments. Thus, the re-evaluation of the architect's contemporary tools in respects to the developed taxonomies of craft validates that this novel perspective can serve as a valuable means of responding to the notion of craftsmanship as a valid form of design and making within our contemporary architectural discourse. Thank you. The current state of architecture.
Okay, well, thank you, Keegan, for your presentation. Now I'm going to open the floor up to our guests for any questions of clarifications before we get into a larger discussion about the project. So Veronica and Haji, do you have any questions of clarification for Keegan?
I do. This is really heady stuff, really interesting. Keegan, could you let me know, like, are we speaking of two separate agents, being the digital craftsman on the one hand and the architect as author of the design? Are these two separate agents, or are we talking about a singular agent that embodies both?
A singular agent that embodies both. So it would be the architect as a craftsman using the architect's current tools that are made available to them. So that's the whole point of the thesis, is to kind of bridge this gap that exists between the loss of craftsmanship and the architect's current kind of passive approach to design, and how do we bridge those two together to create a new contemporary perspective of craftsmanship in architecture.
Interesting.
As
so
an
then,
approach to as an approach to a design methodology, which is through making. So the architect is actively involved in the process of making, and that it kind of works incrementally and trying to derive the chapel's form. So if we look at the slide that's up right now, the material-based design doesn't just begin with the design of the chapel itself through representational design, but it begins with the creation of the architect as the craftsman's tools, the manipulation of the materiality, the interface, and then the development of the brick and how that brick goes on to influence the design of the chapel, and how again the development of the tools and the processes used allow the craftsman to shape the chapel pretty much as they desire without really having a preset definition of what the design is. They design by making on site, but they have a very distinctive process that is based on these contemporary tools of the architect, and that is ruled by the precise taxonomy that has been derived from the theoretical foundations of this thesis.
So in your last two images on the lower right-hand side, yes, some of those white figures would be the actual architect.
Yes, these would be a group of architects / craftsmen in the little illustration right here.
I see.
Yeah.
Veronica or Haji, any other questions of clarification? No?
No clarification.
Okay. The rest of the committee, any questions of clarification? Vince, Jason? No. Okay. So now I'll open up the floor to, once again, our guest critics for questions in general and comments. Veronica or Haji, do either of you want to start?
Sure, I can maybe jump in. Well, thank you, Keegan, for the presentation. I think this is a very interesting and fascinating topic that you're embarking in. We're kind of entering into this world of robotics and machinery and AI, VR, all of these kind of aspects. And the question of how do we maintain craftsmanship in this process that robotics can provide high precision to the process. And so how do we maintain that irregularity, which I think is what you're getting to as in terms of craftsmanship in this highly precise world that we're kind of currently living in? I very much enjoyed your dissertation. I had a chance to kind of read through it, and I thought you very well researched the aspect, and it was really nice to kind of see you build up that process. One of the questions I had, and I'm glad you clarified that a moment ago, as to where does the architect stand in this process of craftsmanship? And it's interesting to hear your response in terms of that the creativity, I'm assuming, is happening on site. So I guess I'd like to understand, maybe, how does the planning process fit into the end result? And more specifically, when we look at, what I'm seeing here is how an individual unit, which is this clay masonry, the making of that, and then the influence that that one unit has on the overall form and form generation, and then the influence that the craftsman and the designer and the architect has in terms of that. How does the design process fit into the initial sketch to the end result?
So the way it based on, if we look at the craftsman's process and the theoretical foundations, mostly if you look at David Pye's kind of theory, is that the craftsman's process is never predetermined and is always dependent on the craftsman as they work. So based on the sketch, it initiates ideas for the craftsman on what the chapel design should be. But then through constant iterative kind of experimentation and just design exploration, they begin to explore these various ideas through making. And so they begin with picking, say, a material like clay because it is relevant to the masonry context of the site. And then they develop their own tools to be engaged as part of that process. And then that again occurs as part of an iterative experimental process of making, where all of a sudden the bricks are derived through this constant engagement and manipulation of the material and constantly testing what they can achieve with the material. And that resulted in distinguishing this unique masonry brick that has been detailed and textured or has certain surface conditions based on what the craftsman has derived throughout the process. And then they seek how can this brick be equipped at a larger scale of architecture, and then they go on to design their own tools. And uh, within this new set of tools, they're trying to seek ways of allowing them to have greater agency over the design. So again, there's no predetermined outcome for the design of the chapel. They have their initial design sketches that they work with at the beginning, but when they're on site, they can manipulate the building however they wish. So they can alter the design, the directionality. Let me just go back to the previous slide. They can alter which bricks they're pushing in, which bricks they're pushing out. So nothing is ever predetermined. It's literally the architect and the craftsman, uh, them as a union together as one entity on site. They can constantly manipulate the design. So in the case on site, if we look at the tool, the tool has these curved platforms that allow the craftsman to control the profile of these shapes. So as they follow the intended design, they have the agency to warp this design and adapt the design while they're on sites. So they're constantly developing the design of the chapel as they make and fabricate and construct the chapel based on the bricks that they have previously kind of explored through the process of making.
So is the brick in itself pre-made, or is it made on site?
The brick is made on site because they have to. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the right slide. The brick is made on site, and it can always be adjusted to the needs that arise on site. So in the case of when talking about risk and having different people involved and the agency of different people involved, and the engagement of those people, each one is going to have a different way of stacking it or placing the mortar in between the bricks that creates these changes and deviations from the actual intended design.
Mhm.
And so so these deviations, sorry, I'm trying to get my thoughts together. Sorry, what was the question again? Can you just repeat that?
Well, you know, I was just asking about the brick in itself because I think that, you know, the brick,
right.
yeah, the brick unit in itself is an individual module of this whole. And I think what you're describing here is how the individual module, which is produced by a relationship between the craftsmanship or the craftsman and the robot, right? Because you're producing these bricks through a machine, correct? Like, so the relationship of those two components are forming these bricks. And what I was trying to understand was, are these bricks modular or are they being manipulated on site? Because I think an individual component like a brick, a modular element is, you know, ultimately will start to dictate some of the form that it can take on, you know, through the ideas of curvature and, you know, and what I was trying to understand is how does the machine, which is a highly precise process, like how are we taking advantage of the robot? Why are we using the robot to make a highly craftsman component? And how does the craftsman engage in that as well? Because I feel like your project is about this component and this kind of articulation between, or this kind of dance, this dialogue between the designer, the craftsmanship, the architect, and what I'm understanding is those are now becoming one and the same again. We went through this process of history where an architect was the craftsman, the builder, the master builder, the mastermind behind these buildings. And then we slowly kind of deviated where the architect was a designer and there was someone who was a craftsman who was putting it together. And then now we're deviating into this world of highly precision automation and assembly, this prefabrication and assembly. And I think where you're kind of trying to come back to is how do we get back to that beauty of craftsmanship and design? And how do we now integrate the new processes like machinery and CNC? But what I'm trying to kind of understand is the intersection between what a robot will give you, which is a highly precise unit, versus what the hand will give you, which is a irregular engagement of the material. So I was trying to understand what are those two unions and how is that influencing the overall architecture?
So there's two ways the bricks can be created. So if you're deriving a new brick, it's always a craftsman's engagement in the process through that augmented experience where they're working, they have a augmented, they create a digital model and then that model is superimposed on their work environment. So they have some area, some scope to work with. And then they themselves have control over the robot to manipulate its movement and move the tool in order to carve the clay. And those movements can be tracked and recorded as part of a digital sketch. But in the case of these bricks over here, one of the front face might be one movement of the craftsman's actions, but then the side conditions where the detail where the bricks come together, that could be another action of the craftsman and how they crafted it. And what the digital sketch allows them to do is create variations based on the craftsman's initial actions to kind of mix and match and explore new ideas of the bricks. The brick is, you might have one variation, but then you can sort of take what the craftsman has done prior and then keep on manipulating to derive new iterations of the brick. But when on site and when you're laying the brick, you may you might have these flaws during the construction process where bricks don't quite tie together because of the way they are detailed based on the craftsman's previous detailing of that condition. And then that's relayed back to the craftsman and the craftsman can once again manipulate the bricks and try to find a different solution to the problem that has arisen on site, adapting the bricks design continually as they need it to.
Yeah.
So they're very involved in the process.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a very interesting concept is how do we come back to this kind of beauty that comes with craftsmanship while using the benefits of what we have now available to us, our tools, which are, CNC machines, these highly interactive robotics, and even, artificial intelligence now that can really start to shape how we can produce things. And I think, one of the things maybe I would suggest to you is to, in following through with this idea, is to maybe understand the benefits of this highly robotic kind of world that we're in, and the parametric abilities that we have now available to us through computers and computational aspects. And I'm really interested in how you said that on site, though, we can create a vision or an idea of what we want to do through sketching, but then on site we're going to do the craftsmanship. We're going to actually construct it through our engagement with other people, through the engagement with the machine, through the site, and kind of being there in that experience. So I'd love to kind of maybe understand maybe what are some other opportunities on that this could formulate on the site, because what it sounds to me is that we have an idea of what we want to create, but the result will never be understood until we get there, until we do it. And it's kind of different than how we've been going about architecture these days, where we're trying to prefabricate every single component right down to the last connection in order to understand the building, and building it even digitally before it actually builds on site. So I'd love to maybe, encourage you to further explore what are the advantages of these two craftsmanship, like the hand and, people engagement, and the computer. How can we utilize that to benefit construction in the future? So, the repetition that you talked about, that perhaps there's this constant manipulation happening, but then it could be logged. How can it be repeated? What are some of the other opportunities that this unit that's constantly being manipulated on site can form in terms of design? But I'll maybe just kind of pass it over to Haji and maybe make some further comments later.
Yeah, I think, where Veronica leaves off is really where my inquisition starts, because I think your investigation is really, and I agree, like the kind of historical and kind of like exploration of like these notions of craftsmanship, master craftsmanship, the architect as master craft, overseeing the design, and how those kind of limits and opportunities for agency in the fabrication of buildings, and where that lands within the digital kind of universe that we all work in now. And these are really, really interesting questions, absolutely. And I think where you're taking this conversation is unique, where the architect maintains on-site fabrication control to enable them to make the so-called call in terms of managing risk. And so I'm understanding risk to be unforeseen factors that may cause adjustments to be made while fabrication or construction is being done, right? And so I think the idea of imperfection or reactive architecture that's enabled by the kind of careful consideration of the units that are being used is certainly valid and interesting, especially in terms of the way buildings are built generally, which are not always by architects, right? So then for me, the question is the distinction between the craftsman and the master craftsman, because I think this is actually a great potential platform for allowing for much greater risk and reaction to the site, where you could seed the problem and analyze the problem as an architect, but actually have, so that would be the role of the master craftsman. You could actually have on the ground craftsmen who have free agency to then use that unit to reactively solve problems locally, so that you could actually derive a much more complex figure or architecture. So for instance, you might say, well, we've got a densely wooded forest and we want to build a chapel in there. We're going to start 6 different teams of craftsmen, and we've got a series of armatures or units that we can use ad hoc and at the whim and will of each craftsman to reactively build something within the forest, for instance. So I think there's like a certain kind of like programmatic release that this allows for as an idea, which I think is very interesting for disaster relief, community, amateur building, all sorts of things. And I know that, for instance, there are two architecture firms in Brooklyn, Situ, S-I-T-U, and Interborough, who are really interested in this kind of amateur architecture that's derived from kind of like a parametrically measured set of constraining aspects that the units that they design kind of like create, for instance. So then you combine the idea of like engineering and other factors within the actual unit themselves. So that's a possible interesting piece. I think really where the potential comes into focus and the big questions start to happen is, as architects, we are always constantly working through constraints and demands that these larger assemblages require, between not only structure, materiality, and durability, beauty, but we also have electrical, water, all sorts of other, things that make our jobs difficult. So that I think is really where an interesting kind of combination of, an autonomous assemblage that the master craftsman can kind of build into the unit, and how then the craftsman then can use those units in concert with other craftsmen, potentially with other systems of understanding the building come together, where at the end, if the mastercraft leaves off their agency with the creation of the unit and says, okay, there you go, and actually is off-site, and it's really the role of the craftsman on-site without overall guidance, I think that's where things get really interesting and potentially very messy.
I think in part I've kind of touched on that with the AR guide, because what the AR guide is supposed to do is kind of have that element of translating the crafts. Like there would be obviously a lead craftsman on site or a lead architect on site, but what the AR design serves as is that question of translating the lead craftsman's vision to the other craftsmen on site. And even though the robot's able to be manipulated, the craftsman doesn't always have to be on site. They could kind of reorient it remotely and then update the other craftsmen on site, update the other craftsmen on site on what the trajectory of the chapel should be as they continue their work. And I think that's kind of what you've been touching on, and that's where it kind of intersects with my thesis currently.
I think, Haji made a really good point in that we work under constraints. And, what I was thinking is that it'd be great, like you have this theory and this kind of idea of how we should be progressing as the next stage of craftsmanship and architecture. And for me, and what I'm hearing from you is that there's a lot more freedom and openness, but maybe the constraint is really about the site. It's the site constraints. What does the site have to offer us that then influences how we approach? And so, I thought it was interesting that you chose the Guild Insight, and I think for you, in terms of further exploration, I would maybe come back to what does the Guild In offer? Like, what does that site in particular offer? Like, had you suggested, what if this was built in a forest? How would that then influence the form and influence the process? And you can say the same for any kind of varied landscape. How does that influence your design?
In a way, that's the way the tools were designed, so that it would allow the craftsman to adapt to site conditions. So the ability to not strictly follow the mosaic guide at the beginning, in where they can replace and update the mosaic, allows them to adapt to the lighting conditions of the site. So they can remove a brick, they can replace a brick that has a different surface texture, so it interacts with the light slightly differently to create a certain different ambiance or lighting condition within the chapel. And so I think they do have that agency to
Mhm.
kind of adapt the design as they see to the site based on the tools that they have.
Yeah, so I think, I can see the possibilities of this. And so I think one thing to maybe consider in your future research of this is that, the testing of it, how does the site actually influence the design, and what would the results be? What could be the possibilities? I think one of the things that is important to always do is with the theory, you should always kind of test out that theory in multiple kind of aspects so that you could present what the opportunities of that are. Because I think this is a really fascinating aspect of making that you're embarking on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I've missed it, but I can't recall if like you created a taxonomy of different brick
Yes,
forms.
of different brick forms. Oh,
Hmm.
that's the digital sketch. Let me just.
Right. I couldn't tell if they were like prototypes or if they were like actually different brick forms.
These were prototypes. Let me find the right slide. So this process over here where it says material outcomes, those were like gradual steps up and kind of in me personally being able to adapt to the use of the tool, because I myself wasn't used to using the KUKA robot, and so
Mhm.
I had to work extensively and progressively towards being able to achieve that design. The curvature on the side that took a long time to actually adjust myself to the way the robot would move and how I could control it to achieve that form. And there were iterations even before this preliminary phase where it was just a block and me trying to cut and constantly adding new components to the end effectors to test different conditions I could how I could score the clay, how I could carve the clay, how I could trim the clay, and so on. So there were prototypes in the beginning, and then it worked out into this one distinct pattern of how the clay could be, how the bricks could come together, which is the helical, I call it the helical pattern, so that they can interlock. So, and based on the research, I wouldn't say that the bricks that are created here are the only way that the tool can be used. The tool is quite diverse in its application, so I could explore other forms of design. I'm not strictly restricted to this masonry unit. That's why I was testing different conditions where you'd have one which is more of an undulating pattern, while the other is more of a wave, so that you could kind of translate between different types of bricks as you create the chapel. So I believe within these green and blue portions, that's where I use a translation to kind of change the the patterning of the brick. And so there's definitely the opportunity to change what the brick looks like. It doesn't have to be these bricks specifically, and it doesn't have to be this process specifically, because I think the application, if the tools, if you use the architect's tools and the taxonomy, you can explore different varieties of approaches in design. It doesn't have to be specifically this way. The AR interface allows a craftsman to create their own set of tools. They can derive a new set of tools, work with a new set of materials, and that's a completely different craftsman's approach to a different design that they may encounter down the line.
I mean, I think there's like a really intriguing kind of complexity where the fabricator can create new tools to make the new units, and then at one point the malleability of the unit itself becomes so complicated and so ad hoc depending on that exact moment that it's like, I wonder if the unit size even is something that is malleable. It's like, how's this that much different than having, we've always seen it as kind of like these clay manipulators that just excrete this continuous band of ooze, right? Like where that's the micro, or do we go to the macro where we're like, prefabricating massive shell structures? So I think there's like a very interesting kind of question of scale there, especially if we're proposing to do this on site as the process is required. I think there is something, traditionally very, very valuable, but a unitized component, even if there is, and this is why I asked if there are prototypes, where, you could probably transition from different types of angular relationships when you're creating different radiuses of these dome structures by relying on the craftsman, right? Like, you're not really proposing something where you're going mortar free, for instance, which could have been a possibility as well. So I think there's like the, tightening up those kind of like restrictive aspects to the possibilities that it gives in terms of variability, because you could theoretically map between 20 to 200 different types of brick and just map how that actually should go together if it's non-dependent on mortar, or you could have like a much more cruder set of prototypes that then relies very heavily on the craftsmen in terms of how they're able to use the mortar. And we've always seen, of course, traditional bricklaying done by robotic assistants, which relies on a singular unit, and then it can actually create so many interesting aspects of what the architectural, end result is.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. I think we're reaching close to the end, so I wanted to kind of open up the conversation to Jason and Vincent, if you wanted to say, have some comments or some final remarks as well.
Sure. Thank you, Keegan, for your presentation. I think it was a privilege working with you in the shop with the robot and seeing that type of manipulation and iterations that you were able to take on in this brick making exercise, but then also how it turns into architecture. And the development of a tool, the process that you went through in experimenting and understanding the knowledge that goes into what is required of constructability and structure and detailing of a typical architecture. It's very interesting to me that it's kind of a different interpretation of my personal definition of a digital craftsman, and how using extremely advanced technologies, I would normally imbue the digital model with as much information as possible, and then output that product. For you, it's very interesting in that the catalog of information is never ending. The architect is constantly learning and developing new methods and practices as to how material can be manipulated, and how that material or that object or component can be turned into a constructed element or architecture as a whole. And so this idea of how augmented reality is a let's say a programming for architecture, and that it could constantly evolve, and new end effectors or new tools could be implemented in the design process to create architecture is profound. And I can imagine dozens and dozens of robots on a condo site, for example, constantly changing their end effectors and constantly manipulating their agency together, while maybe you don't have craftsmen on site. Maybe all the architects are sitting in an office downstairs, across the street, and they're in real time manipulating the architecture and based off of all these learned things that were accomplished early on in the design process. And for you, we saw it firsthand. I saw it firsthand, which is carving the clay and heating up that wire, using a little bit of water here and there, seeing how the rollers trenched into the material, and all of that was all that information is just so interesting to the development of the thesis. And so that work is super important. And so for me, like hearing what Haji and Veronica were saying, like the adaptation of the architect to your process is super interesting, and how an architect would actually, take on this subject. So, are they building end effectors constantly? Or are they simply speaking to the craftsmen that, have been laying bricks over and over? And how are they developing these tools? And how are they updating their catalog of design and construction operations is super interesting to me. So, yeah, great job.
Thank you.
So I know that we're short of time. And I'm really glad to hear that Veronica Haji had commented and asked questions that I kind of also had permutations of. So thank you for that. And also, it's interesting to hear, Jason, you're talking about the advancements and possibilities of going into telepresence on site and stuff. So it is very promising. I think the only question I had left over from my list of comments and questions for you, Keegan, would be, in your book, you talked about Sennett and how he was addressing the multifaceted nature of what architecture is and how complex it was. And you also go on length in our conversations, and certainly in the book, about the kind of bespoke details of Zumthor and Scarpa. So you describe the production of the unit, and of course the overall chapel, and maybe it comes back to something that Veronica had raised earlier about the context. But one of my questions was, could you, in light of that, could you describe how the materials and methods reinforce the actual architectural effects, right? Because you deliberately picked a site with steeped in a lot of history with masonry. It was on kind of an existing context of certain artifacts on the site. And I was wondering, you also made it specific a chapel that had a desired effect. Like there was this kind of spirituality that comes about from the design of your space, not just simply having the cross on the back wall, right? It's more than just that. So you've created these units in a certain way. I was wondering if you could just speak to aside from the kind of way they tessellate and work together, I was wondering if you could just elaborate on how it was designed, how those units were designed to actually have an effect that responded to the site and possibly even the program.
Well, in terms of the design research came before the design project. And so I wasn't really sure where the design project was going to go until I developed the brick. And because of the design research and then the evolution of my thesis into exploring a site, it just happened that the site was so significantly steeped in this idea of the masonry that the design research that I previously started off with kind of helped me transition and evolve this idea even more. And my initial exploration of the brick was not even this form. It was kind of just this straight linear shape that didn't have much diversity or complexity to it. And then in looking at this site, which was kind of happening in a parallel in the same time of working in shop, that kind of influenced how I wanted to design the brick, kind of looking for something more unique in comparison to kind of the ubiquitous materials that were already pre-existing on site. Because if we look at, if I can find the right slide, so a lot of the bricks on site were standard in nature, which seemed very similar to what I was working with initially. And so trying to work with something that was more unique, more novel in terms of a masonry unit was something that I, in exploring the Craftsman, felt like that's something the Craftsman would want to do, is look at something that is unique and not reflective of the past, but looking towards almost something novel and towards the future and how we could accomplish that. And in terms of the why it was a chapel and why it had certain like a certain, like the way the cross was set up, that was pretty much because the site is now used for wedding venues and they don't really have a chapel on site. So I thought that would be the best programming in terms of designing the chapel.
But I just want to make it, it's not about that direction. I'm going the other way around. I'm saying, can you tell me how the individual brick units, masonry units, were designed to give rise to the kind of effects, the architectural effects that one would have in a spiritual space like a chapel?
Oh, Okay, so that came out of the way the brick was actually the different surface conditions. So if you look at some of the looking at the crafted details, so the undulating waves and the curvatures on the side was mostly for creating the detail by which they would tie together. But if we look on a render on the inside of the chapel, the main structural unit have these more wavy patterns, and it's supposed to be a more glossy finish so that it reflects based on the lighting of the chapel, instead of it just being a flat face brick, kind of curating all these different textures. And on the outside too, the detailing of the clay bed was specifically curated so that during a season of heavy precipitation, the structure would actually be able to drain off water and shed water off without having ice build up over the winter and it kind of seeping into these bricks and cracking them up or whatever. But the bricks was specifically curated to react to the lighting conditions of the site. And um, in the case of some of the bricks at the interior of the chapel, they were scored with more linear elements that would focus the viewer's gaze inwards. So it's highly specific to the intention of what the architect and the craftsman wanted the viewer to experience at that specific point in time. So when entering the threshold of the chapel, these bricks have this linear kind of momentum pushing the viewer forward, and then when they enter the chapel, you have these more glossy, more reflective clay bricks on the inside, and so the finish of the brick was changed and was different based on what the architect wanted to convey to the viewer and to the user on the site.
Okay, thanks.
Well, Marco, did you have any last comments before we all congregate for?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add that hasn't already been said, but just a couple of things I wanted to bring up. Keegan, I was just sort of looking through your document, and I just wanted to mention, if you haven't come across this architect, you might want to have a look at Lars Spoybrook. And he's written a lot about craft in the digital age. And I think if this is a discourse that you're interested in continuing to engage with, I would strongly recommend you have a look at him. I don't know if you maybe did look at him and decided it wasn't the right thing for you, but I think for a thesis that's talking about digital craft, I think you should at least have a look at it. I don't think it's something you have to circle back and incorporate at this point, but I think if you're interested in this discourse, it's something he's a pretty interesting voice around the role of craft in a digital age. Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to ask about was, for me, this question about precision versus imperfection is a really interesting one in relation to craft, because I think we can define craft in both those ways. And for me, a really interesting question is where is the imprecision, or where is the imperfection and where is the precision? Is it in the unit itself, or is it in some other aspect of its assembly? And one example that comes to mind is Le Corbusier and the Maison Jaoul, which are houses, a series of houses just outside of Paris, where the brick walls there, I mean, he uses a standard brick, so presumably it's as, consistent as bricks are, not always 100%. But in order to attain what he wanted to read as a very kind of handmade quality, he specified that during the laying of the brick, the masons would have to keep switching. Like they'd lay part of the wall, then they'd move on to another wall, and a different mason would come and take over, so that there was different hands on that wall. And in his mind, that meant that there would be subtle differences in the laying of the brick, subtle imperfections in the wall, so that you could really read it as handmade. So that's a different way of thinking about where the imperfection lies. It's not necessarily in the element itself, but somehow in the making. So I think that's a kind of interesting thing to think about, is this tension between, you know, when we think of someone like Scarpa, we don't think of that as imperfect, right? I mean, there's an incredible attention to precision. There are imperfections, of course, but that kind of craft to me speaks to an ambition for incredible precision. And so one of my questions to you, and it's not one I'm looking for an answer to, but I'm thinking in the context of the way you've presented this, one of my questions to you would be, is, you know, where does this precision versus imperfection lie, and what is that tension, and how does that get expressed, or that's not even the right word. How do you manage that tension? How, you know, where do you seek precision and where do you seek imperfection?
Okay.
Yeah. No. Yeah, and I think a brick itself is a unit, but it comes together with the mortar, and I think the joint is an important thing to think about as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Look also at Sigurd Leverance, right? Leverance and the way he uses brick is quite remarkable. In some ways sloppy as hell, but quite fantastic. Right?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Keegan. You've come a long way, and you're almost there. We're going to ask you to log off, and we will deliberate and take this moment to thank our guests as well for their time and feedback that you've given, Keegan.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Keegan.
I'll send you a message
Thank
later.
you.
Okay?
Sure.